right defense and release from fear. The real meaning of possession. The real meaning of possession should be clarified. Fear of possession is a perverted expression of the fear of the irresistible attraction of God. The truth is still that the attraction of God is irresistible at all levels, and the acceptance of this totally unavoidable truth is only a matter of time. But you should consider whether you want to wait, because you can return now, if you choose. Possession is a concept which has been subject to numerous distortions, some of which we will list below. Type 1. Possession can be associated with the body only. If this occurs, sex is particularly likely to be contaminated. Possession versus being possessed is apt to be seen as the male versus the female role. Since neither will be conceived of as satisfying alone, and both will be associated with fear, this interpretation is particularly vulnerable to psychosexual confusion. Type 2. From a rather similar reference point, possession can also be associated with things. This is essentially a shift from type 1 and is usually due to an underlying fear of associating possession with people. In this sense, it is an attempt to protect people from one's possessiveness, like the superstition about protecting the name we mentioned before. Both type 1 and type 2 are likely to become compulsive for several reasons, including A. They represent an attempt to escape from the real possession drive, which cannot be satisfied this way. B. They set up substitute goals, which are usually reasonably easy to attain. C. They appear to be relatively harmless, and thus seem to allay fear. The fact that they usually interfere with good interpersonal relationships can be interpreted in this culture as a lack of sophistication on the part of the other, not the self, and thus induces a false feeling of confidence in the solution. It is also fairly easy to find a partner who shares the illusion. Thus, we have any number of relationships which are actually established on the basis of type 1, and others which hold together primarily because of a joint interest in type 2. D. The manifestly external emphasis which both entail seems to be a safety device, and thus permits a false escape from much more basic inhabitations. As a compromise solution, the illusion of interpersonal relating is preserved, along with the retention of lack of love. This kind of psychic juggling leaves the juggler with a feeling of emptiness, which in fact is perfectly justified because he is acting from scarcity. He then becomes more and more driven in his behavior to fill the emptiness. When these solutions have been invested with extreme belief, type 1 leads to sex crimes, and type 2 to stealing. The kleptomaniac is a good example of the latter. Generally, 3 types of emotional disturbance result. A. The tendency to maintain the illusion that only the physical is real. This produces depression. B. The tendency to invest the physical with non-physical properties. This is essentially magic and tends more toward anxiety proneness. C. The tendency to vacillate from one to the other which produces a corresponding vacillation between depression and anxiety. All three result in self-imposed starvation. Type 3. Another type of distortion is seen in the fear of or desire for spirit possession. The term spirit is profoundly debased in this context, but it does entail a recognition that the body is not enough and investing it with magic will not work. This recognition accepts the fact that neither type 1 nor type 2 is sufficient, but precisely because it does not limit fear so narrowly, it is more likely to produce greater fear in its own right. Endowing the spirit with human possessiveness is a more inclusive error than type 1 or type 2, and a step somewhat further away from the right mind. Projection is also more likely to occur with vacillations between grandiosity and fear. Religion, in a distorted sense, is also more likely to occur in this kind of error, because the idea of spirit is introduced, though fallaciously, while it is excluded from type 1 and type 2. Witchcraft is thus particularly apt to be associated with type 3, because of the much greater investment in magic. It should be noted that type 1 involves only the body, and type 2 involves an attempt to associate things with human attributes. Type 3, on the other hand, is a more serious level confusion, because it endows the spirit with evil attributes. This accounts both for the religious zeal of its proponents and the aversion or fear of its opponents. Both attitudes stem from the same false belief. This is not what the Bible means by filled with the Holy Spirit. The concept of speaking in many tongues was originally an injunction to communicate to everyone in his own language, or at his own level. It is hardly meant to speak in a way that nobody could understand. This strange error occurs when people do understand the need for universal communication, but have contaminated it with the possession fallacy. The fear engendered by this misperception leads to a conflicted state in which communication is attempted, but the fear is allayed by making the communication incomprehensible. It could also be said that the fear induces selfishness or regression, because incomprehensible communication is hardly a worthy offering from one Son of God to another. Type 4. Knowledge can also be misinterpreted as a means of possession. Here, the content is not physical, and the underlying fallacy is more likely to be the confusion of mind and brain. The attempt to unite non-physical content with physical attributes is illustrated by statements like the thirst for knowledge. This is not what thirst in the Bible means. The term was used only because of humanity's limited comprehension and is probably better dropped. The fallacious use of knowledge can result in several errors, including A. The idea that knowledge will make the individual more attractive to others. This is a possession fallacy. B. The idea that knowledge will make the individual invulnerable. This is a reaction formation against the underlying fear of vulnerability. C. The idea that knowledge will make the individual worthy. This is largely pathetic. Like all of these fallacies, type 4 contains a denial mechanism which swings into operation as the fear increases, thus cancelling out the error temporarily. but seriously impairing efficiency. For example, one person might claim she cannot read, while another might claim he cannot speak. Note that depression is a real risk here, for a child of God should never reduce his efficiency in any way. The depression comes from a peculiar pseudo-solution, which reads, "A child of God is efficient. I am not efficient. Therefore, I am not a child of God." This leads to neurotic resignation, and this is a state which merely increases the depression. The corresponding denial mechanism for type 1 is physical inability, or impotence. The denial mechanism for type 2 is often bankruptcy. Collectors of things often drive themselves well beyond their financial means, in an attempt to force discontinuance. If this idea of cessation cannot be tolerated, a strange compromise involving both insatiable possessiveness and insatiable throwing away may result. An example is the inveterate or compulsive gambler, particularly the horse racing addict. Here the conflicted drive is displaced both from people and things, and is invested in animals. The implied derogation of people is the cause of the underlying extreme superstition of the horse racing addict. The alcoholic is in a similar position, except that his hostility is more inward than outward directed. Defenses aimed at protecting or retaining error are particularly hard to undo, because they introduce second-order misperceptions, which obscure the underlying errors still further. The pseudo-corrective mechanism for type 3 is apt to be more varied because of the more inclusive nature of the error, which has already been mentioned. Some of the possibilities are listed below. A. One aspect of the possession-possessed conflict can be raised to predominance. If this is attempted in connection with possessing, it leads to the paranoid solution. The underlying component of being possessed is retained in the persecution fantasies which generally accompany the paranoia. B. If being possessed is brought to ascendance, a state of some sort of possession by external forces results, but not with a major emphasis on attacking others. Attack by others becomes the more obvious component. In the more virulent forms, there is a sense of being possessed by demons, and unless this vacillates with a catatonic solution is more likely than a paranoid one. The focused paranoid has become more rigid in his solution, and centers on one source of projection to escape from vacillation. It should be noted that this type of paranoia is an upside-down form of religion, because of its obvious attempt to unify into oneness. Type 1, 2, and 4 are more likely to produce neurotic rather than psychotic states, though this is by no means guaranteed. However, type 3 is inherently more vulnerable to psychosis, again because of the more fundamental level confusion which is involved. It should be noted that the greater fear which is induced by type 3 can itself reach psychotic proportions, thus forcing the individual closer and closer to a psychotic solution. It is emphasized here that these differences have no effect at all on the miracle, which can heal any of them with equal ease. This is because of the miracle's inherent avoidance of within-error distinctions. Its sole concern is to distinguish between truth on the one hand and all kinds of error on the other. This is why some miracles seem to be of greater magnitude than others. But remember the first principle in this course, that there is no order of difficulty in miracles. The emphasis on mental illness, which is marked in these notes, reflects the undoing aspect of the miracle. The doing aspect is, of course, much more important. But a true miracle cannot occur on a false basis. Sometimes the undoing must precede it. At other times, both can occur simultaneously. But you are not up to this at the moment. Further, insights into mental illness can be misused and can lead to preoccupation with one's own symptoms. This is why this area is less constructive for most people than a course primarily devoted to mental health. However, some professions will find some principles of mental illness constructive, especially those which are concerned with mental illness in others. This obviously includes psychologists. The obvious correction for all types of the possession fallacy is to redefine possession correctly. In the sense of taking over, the concept does not exist at all in divine reality, which is the only level where real existence is a meaningful term. No one can be taken over unless he wills to be. However, if he places his mind under tyranny rather than through authority, see previous reference, he intrudes the concept of submission dominance onto free will himself. This produces the obvious contradiction inherent in any formulation which associates free will with imprisonment. Even in very mild forms, this kind of association is risky and may spread quite unexpectedly, particularly under external stress. This is because it can be internally controlled only if external conditions are peaceful. This is not safe, because external conditions are produced by the thoughts of many, not all of whom are pure in heart as yet. Why should you be at their mercy? This issue is very closely related to the whole possession issue. You are thinking that people can possess you if you believe that their thoughts, or the external environment, can affect you regardless of what they think. You are perfectly unaffected by all expressions of lack of love. These can be either from yourself and others, or from yourself to others, or from others to you. Peace is an attribute in you. You cannot find it outside. All mental illness is some form of external searching. Mental health is inner peace. It enables you to remain unshaken by lack of love from without, and capable, through your own miracles, of correcting the external conditions which proceed from lack of love in others.